Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 182. This week the questions are taken from the Wednesday video on the Battle of Midway, and that was the discussion of its myths, legends and greatness with John Partial, and of course a 5-minute guide. This one was Guide 233, the guide to USS Saratoga CV3. Vanders asks, can you explain the differences between British and Japanese night fighting doctrine during World War II, and which, in your opinion, was the better? Now, obviously that's an incredibly complex subject and something that can and will be addressed at some point in the future in a much longer video. But very briefly, taking into account that we're talking about at the start of World War II, because covering all the differences between various bits of night fighting doctrine, if you want to go through the entirety of World War II as both Navy's night fighting doctrine and everyone else's is evolving, is just hideously complex. But anyway, broadly, at the beginning of the war, or at least their involvement in the war, Japanese night fighting doctrine was primarily geared around their cruisers and destroyers, and that in and of itself was primarily geared around the idea of a decisive fleet action. Now obviously that didn't mean they were restricted to that, First Battle of Savo Island being a good example, but the vast majority of their night fighting ideas were concentrated around the idea of torpedo attacks with long lance torpedoes, as I said, by their destroyers and cruisers, which would then be followed up by gunfire. And in a lot of the early night engagements, that's exactly what you see. The use of capital ships in night fighting was not planned for. Obviously, with things like the two night actions at the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, that did happen with Hie and Kirishima, but that wasn't something that was extensively drilled for in the run-up to World War II. The Congos specifically got a little bit of extra night training as compared to the rest of the battle line, which didn't really get too much at all, because there was some thought the Congos might be supporting the cruisers in a night attack on an enemy fleet, and the aircraft carriers were designed pretty much at that point to operate during the day. Whereas the British, having had almost no night fighting training in World War I, but having experienced what the German Navy could do with their night fighting training during the same conflict, had really got the bit between their teeth for this particular type of fighting, and they'd gone all in. Cruisers were designed to night fight, destroyers were trained for night fighting, even the battleships were trained for night fighting, as were the aircraft carriers' air groups. Everything, as far as the British were concerned, should be capable of fighting at night, and ideally should fight at night, period. I mean, they're not going to reject a daytime engagement, and obviously daytime airstrikes with carriers are a lot easier to pull off, but they realised that if other people weren't as good at them at night fighting, that would give them a fairly strong advantage. And of course, in the early part of World War II, the British had a radar advantage over almost everybody else, which would also help with technology influencing things just as much as training and searchlight and all the older kinds of things. But when it came to the British doctrine, this was based on the fact that they anticipated that in any war, at least for the first few months / maybe a couple of years, their local forces would be outnumbered, because they had to keep an eye on Japan, they had to keep an eye on the northern parts of European waters, they had to keep an eye on the Mediterranean. So although they had an overall larger navy than anyone bar the US, any individual conflict would probably be fought at a numerical disadvantage, and thus having the advantage of fighting at night would make things a lot better for them. And you can see this in a lot of the strategies that the Royal Navy comes up with. I mean, Renown, in the lead up to the action at Lofoten, is perfectly happy playing along day, night, poor weather, bad weather, ready to engage whenever. Admiral Holland, of course, initially is planning to engage Bismarck and Prince Eugen at night. Taranto is a nighttime raid. Numerous destroyer actions are done at night. Cruisers are quite happy to both shadow enemies and engage them in nighttime actions. So overall, as World War II turned out, I think the British had a better concept and technology for overall night fighting, and indeed in the opening stages of the Pacific campaign, there were a couple of incidents where the British and Japanese ran into each other in night fighting incidents, and the British generally outplayed the Japanese. There's a particular destroyer action, which at some point I need to do a video on, which involved British destroyers sneaking through the highly trained at-night fighting Japanese destroyer line and then getting back out again, although one of them was caught on the way out. But the British, because of the way they designed their night fighting strategy, didn't have the same kind of layered night fighting mass attack doctrine for going after enemy fleets. They did have night fighting doctrine for going after enemy capital ships and such, but it was a lot more scattered, spread out, designed to deal with individual targets or squadrons rather than a whole fleet action. So if there had been some kind of mass night fleet action in the early part of the war, the Japanese emphasis on cruisers and destroyers with mass torpedo strikes, with obviously the advantage of the long lance, probably would have given them at least an initial upper hand, albeit at that point the Japanese were aiming for a daytime battle with their battleships, whereas if the British chose to press such an action with their night fighting capable battleships, that could end quite badly for the Japanese. Lord Lloyd asks, I'm interested in why Japan was so poor at generating new aircrew. Their air arm was so well and pragmatically prepared for December 1941, but it's as if the need for replacements completely escaped them. By early 43, their attack arm was far less effective. Well, it's such a systemic issue that, again, it's one of those things that could take up a whole Wednesday video, but there are four primary reasons, but four of the bigger reasons why Japan had a problem replenishing the aircrew. Well, first, the losses they suffered to their professional aircrews. This is something that's perhaps not always appreciated. During things like Eastern Solomon, Santa Cruz, etc., the Japanese lost an awful lot of their experienced pilots, either killed or injured. And even if in some battles they didn't necessarily lose carriers, the sheer number of aircraft and thus aircrew that were lost had a significant impact on their ability to regenerate overall air groups. And the loss of skilled crew is something that repeats itself time and again as a soft factor, I would say, that isn't perhaps necessarily always well considered when it comes to long-term conflicts. You actually see this as well in the late 18th-early 19th century wars in the Age of Sail. When you look at various battles between, say, it's normally the British versus somebody, but let's say it's Britain versus France, which seems to be the most common encounters. It's not just about numbers of ships lost or surrendered or sunk or whatever, because outside of a few Nelsonian battles, that's generally not tremendously large numbers of ships, and obviously they're changing hands. A lot of the time they're not sinking or exploding, although that does happen occasionally. But when you look at the casualty figures, they're incredibly lopsided. A lot of battles you might come out with a few hundred British dead, but several thousand French dead. And if you've lost thousands of experienced, trained sailors, then even if you've got a fleet that is nominally of roughly still the same size, the next set of crews are likely to be massively less experienced, and the same was happening with the Japanese fighter pilot corps. The other three issues were, very briefly, one, their pilot training program didn't expand to on the same kind of scale that British, German, or American fighter pilot training schools did, especially the American ones. So there just wasn't the throughput available. They did try to expand it later in the war, but by that point it was a bit too late, so they hadn't really prepared to gear up their training program. Another factor, their training program was designed to produce the elite of the elite of the elite. So even with the relatively limited intakes they had, the attrition rate of pilots was pretty high, sometimes literally and often figuratively, in terms of your pilots being washed out. And that obviously then affects the number of pilots you have available at the end, because a pilot who is, let's say, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you say, right, well, we only want 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 pilots, well, that's going to be very few. Whereas other pilot training schools might go, okay, well, we'll accept the 7 out of 10s or 8 out of 10s because they're still above average, because average is 5 out of 10. But we'll accept the 7s and the 8s. We'll just note that, they're potentially not quite as good as the others and maybe shouldn't be put into certain roles. But that still gives you a lot more pilots and allows you to concentrate your really, really good pilots in areas where they're absolutely needed. And of course, combat experience will have some fairly significant changes on who exactly constitutes what score of pilot, because someone who's 10 out of 10 absolutely perfect straight out flying school might be a little bit too rigidly sticking to doctrine and 3 months later get shot down in flames, whereas someone who came out of flight school as, say, a 7 out of 10 might be a little bit cautious, a little bit pragmatic, and therefore might survive the war, and picking up years and years of combat experience actually becomes one of the most lethal pilots in the skies. So there's that issue as well. And then finally, it's also the way the system was rigged. So as far as the Japanese were concerned, again, for the most part, because it's not a hard and fast universal rule, but if you were a good pilot, you were kept on the front lines to keep doing damage to the enemy. Whereas under US and UK training systems, if you were a good pilot, after a while, you'd be rotated back home to pass on your lessons and instructions to the new pilots coming up through various flight schools. So those pilots would come out with a few extra tips and tricks that weren't perhaps necessarily in the standard syllabus, which improves the overall quality of the pilots who are graduating. Whereas for the Japanese, and to an extent the Germans as well, by keeping your elite pilots out on the front line all the time, yes, they might be able to rack up some fairly impressive individual kill scores, but none of that is being fed back to the pilots that are now coming out. So you might have a squadron where one guy is exceptionally good and might rack up 40 or 50 kills, but everybody else is dying within 2 or 3 weeks of being put on the front lines, which means the overall squadron score for the year might be, if he might get 50 or 60 kills over the course of the war, the overall squadron might have downed 20 aircraft over the year. Whereas if you have pilots who have been instructed by elite pilots themselves during training, even if each of them only takes out, say, 3 or 4 aircraft, so none of them make ace, let's say they all take out an average of 4, well, if those 11 people are taking out 4 aircraft, then that's 44 kills plus whatever the elite pilot might be able to take out as well, which means you might be putting down 60 aircraft instead of 20 over the course of a year, which of course is a much, much better result overall, because you've done 3 times as much damage to the enemy's air wing. Craig Hagenbrook asks, I watched World War II's video about their weekly coverage, and they mentioned how the Americans asked the British if they could borrow a carrier for Midway and were denied. If the Brits had approved King's request, could this have balanced Midway out, and could the outcome have, what would the outcome have been had the British got involved, or would it still have been US aircraft on a British CV like they did with USS Robin? Now, if this had happened, it would have been either illustrious or formidable, because both of them were with the Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean in the run-up to the Battle of Midway, and also kind of at the time. So they would have technically been physically capable of reaching the US forces in time for Midway, as opposed to Victorious and Indomitable, which were in the Mediterranean, and not so much. Assuming for a moment that let's say Illustrious is released for whatever reason. Now, she has, at that time, she's operating up against Vichy French forces, but we know what her air group was in kind of spring going into summer 42. So she has approximately 2 squadrons worth of martlets, i.e. F4F Wildcats, a couple of squadrons worth of swordfish, and a single Fulmar equipped for night fighting. So, surprisingly, that actually means that she already has, half her air group is already American-built aircraft, so cross-compatibility is going to be there. I don't think there would have been the time or the effort put in to replace the Swordfish with any US aircraft, because, well, what are you going to replace it with? Devastators? A little bit of hindsight, but let's face it, the Devastator is still a somewhat old aircraft. It's almost contemporaneous with the Swordfish, in fact, so there's no real advantage to that. And if you think the US is going to sort of suddenly scramble to put Avengers down on a British flight deck when they don't even have Avengers on their own fleet carrier flight decks, well, that's another you've got another thing coming there. So what could Illustrious have accomplished? Well, if you want to posit an absolute sort of perfect timeline, then you could have Illustrious take point, at which point theoretically the Japanese aircraft that come in after Yorktown go after Illustrious, at which point she's better at dodging torpedoes and her deck can quite easily tank 550-pound bomb hits, so she might get beaten up a little bit, but everybody on the Allied side goes home. That's an ideal scenario. More practically, I mean, you're putting a couple of dozen more fighters available. They're not obviously trained to operate directly with the US strike squadrons, so I don't think they'd be put on escort duty, but they'd probably end up being used as a combat air patrol. So a couple of dozen more Wildcats on combat air patrol over the Allied fleet would, again, potentially save Yorktown, but through the medium of just shooting down incoming attackers, especially because the British do have an advantage in fighter control and direction at this point. So they'd be quite potent in that role. As for what the Swordfish could do, I mean, I suppose you could send the Swordfish out with sort of similar to the Devastators and get them to try and torpedo something, and their insane durability might mean they get some drops on things, and their torpedoes actually work, so if they do get some drops on things, they might actually do some damage, but it's going to be very much luck of the draw. I mean, the Devastators were chewed out of the sky in large part because of a mixture of zero attacks and anti-aircraft fire. Unescorted Swordfish don't tend to do spectacularly well when faced with large numbers of enemy fighters, so it's entirely possible the Swordfish might just get chewed up as badly as the Devastators. The flip side, of course, being that the Swordfish are capable of night fighting strikes, so if Illustrious is mostly concerned with keeping her fighters up as a combat air patrol, the US carriers might decide, well, we've got Dauntlesses, we've got Avengers, let's not mix everything up with a bunch of biplanes going in as well, at which point the Swordfish might be kept on deck until most of the day's action is done. Japanese attackers, as I said, on Yorktown may be beaten off by Illustrious's fighter group, at which point, come the close of the day, given that obviously the US is concerned that the Japanese might be surging forward to try and engage the carriers, which is why they withdrew, you might end up in a position where Illustrious is now acting as a rear guard and sends out her Swordfish to do a bit of a reconnaissance to see if they are in fact being pursued, and if so, to torpedo the ships that are pursuing them. Which, they probably won't find anything, but there's a small chance they might find some element of the Japanese fleet somewhere in the late afternoon, early evening and hit it, but relatively unlikely. So Illustrious's greatest contributions are probably going to be either as a bomb magnet or potentially more likely just offering a fairly well-directed combat air patrol, which might save Yorktown. Yamato 8125 asks, it's known that the US submarine Nautilus was indirectly essential to the squadrons of McCluskey and Best, but what if the Nautilus had hit a carrier or a battleship before the torpedo and dive bomber attacks? What would be the course of action of Admiral Nagumo? To be honest, probably not much. If Nautilus is able to get its attacks in before the US aircraft go in, that effectively means that she's not been detected. So she's going to get a surprise drop on the Japanese fleet, but we kind of know what would have happened because of what happened with their attack on Kaga. Basically nothing. If the Japanese might notice some torpedoes in the water early, they might get a bit panicked, send a destroyer after her. But given the performance of the Mark 14 in general in the early half of 1942, and Nautilus's torpedoes specifically when it came to that particular day, it's incredibly likely that all the torpedoes are going to do is either shatter against the hull of an enemy ship, or just literally poke a hole in it with an inert, non-functioning torpedo, which might scare a few people, and as I say, send a few aircraft out, send some destroyers out, but is actually probably not going to affect Nagumo's actions much, if at all. Because why would it? The submarine has failed to do any damage. He's got the assets on hand to deal with that sub. So, moving on to more important things. About the most important thing that Nautilus could have done at that point would have been, once she launched the torpedoes that would do nothing, would be to try and beat a little bit of a retreat, keep the enemy fleet in sight, and try and put out some kind of signal that could indicate to the US pilots where they where the enemy fleet actually is, in lieu of obviously, as was historically occurring, being chased by a destroyer, which then went back to the fleet, which gave the US pilots something to follow to find the Japanese fleet. Posy Jr. asks, did anyone at any point in history, if documented, try to shoot at incoming torpedoes with the intention of defending their ship? Yes, it is actually documented quite a few times. A number of carrier aircraft are documented as strafing the water to try and detonate torpedoes that were either heading at their ship or a ship that they knew. There is, of course, one of the fighter pilots from Taiho who actually tried that, didn't work, and then kamikazed his aircraft into the torpedo. Obviously didn't help Taiho entirely, but definitely an effort that was quite brave. And there are also instances where torpedo wakes were spotted of ships trying to engage the torpedo with their guns of varying descriptions. Usually that didn't work out quite so well, because the torpedoes were usually running a bit too deep for the guns to have much effect. But there are occasional records where it seems to have possibly worked. And I think there is a little bit of a confluence going on, because where a torpedo wake is more visible and easier to spot, it tends also to run when the torpedo is actually running a bit shallower than it should be doing. For one example, there's an account that's repeated in several books with, the name of the person and what convoy they were in, where a chap was on a merchant ship in a convoy, and they spotted the incoming wake of a torpedo, and you can tell it's a shallow runner because at one point he actually spots the torpedo itself. He then takes his 303 rifle and basically, on a kind of, I might as well try something, aims at the torpedo, closes his eyes, pulls the trigger. There's a colossal explosion, which, to be honest, is probably the air flask rupturing. And when he opens his eyes, he's like, I'm still alive. And the torpedo isn't. Yay, we win. And everybody is congratulating him and telling him that's a 1 in a million shot, etc., etc. Now, 303 Lee Enfield is not going to be able to put a bullet deep enough in the water to stop an incoming German U-boat torpedo if it's actually running at the correct depth. But as I said, the indications from the story are that this torpedo was running shallow anyway. Now, shallow running torpedoes still would have blown a socking great hole in the side of the ship and probably sent it to the bottom, so it was very definitely a fortunate thing that he did, but it's not the kind of thing that you'd be able to repeat on a regular basis. Unemployed history major asks, can you give some examples of aircraft stored from the ceilings of hangars? How are they lifted or lowered, and what secured them in place? Sure, here's a picture of Lexington's hangar. And you can see the aircraft are not stored all in one piece. You have the fuselages up there, landing gear up, etc., all nicely, neatly stored away. And the wings will be somewhere else. Depending on the carrier, the wings might also be stashed away somewhere else up in the upper portions of the hangar, or they might be stored on the sides or against the walls or something like that. And you can see where the hangar height advantage comes in play here, because there's so much space up there to store these aircraft. And as you can see, they're secured. If you look at, say, the tail of the nearest aircraft, or the engine and the stub wing of the next one, the aircraft 256, you can see that they're secured by cabling and chains, and so they'd be raised and lowered by means of winches and pulleys built into the hangar systems, the hangars themselves. So they're fairly secure. They'll move a little bit with the ship's movement, but hopefully they're secured tightly enough not to smash into the girders that are either side of them. And the idea of these aircraft is not to form part of the carrier's ready reserve of aircraft, basically, that can be launched at any given time. And this is one of the things where it can be slightly deceptive, as I've mentioned before, looking at US carrier aircraft numbers, because obviously you have, with any carrier, you have the aircraft that are actually stored in the hangar itself. Then, if the carrier, like this one, can store aircraft above the hangar deck, then those aircraft are sometimes counted, and then of course you also have aircraft that you can store in the deck park. Now, whether or not you count the number of aircraft that are stored in the upper portions of the hangar like this does then become somewhat difficult to keep track of, because obviously it is a good idea to note how many aircraft are physically aboard, but if you're going to do that, you do have to make a distinction between aircraft physically carried and aircraft that are operationally available for any given mission. Because one of the reasons these aircraft are stored up in the ceiling is because there isn't enough space for them on the actual hangar deck, and depending on the aircraft, depending on the time, depending on the carrier, there may not even be the pilots to operate every single aircraft. So you might have, let's say, an order of battle that says, yes, well, this carrier is carrying 92 aircraft. Great, but if 22 of them are stored up in the ceiling, you actually have 70 aircraft, and you might only have just over 70 pilots, so you can only operate just over 70 aircraft at any given time. The difference being that, if you send out your 70 aircraft and, say, a dozen of them come back full of holes and 3 of them crash nearby, but the pilots are rescued, well, then you could winch down replacements from the ceiling, put them all together, and then if you go on another mission a day, 2 days later, or whatever time period is appropriate, you'll be able to launch 70 aircraft again, which is obviously a significant advantage over a carrier that can't do this, which, if it loses 15 aircraft, well, it's down 15 aircraft, and that's that. Boston Rail Fan asks, the Lexingtons were built in the late 20s with 8 big guns, but they only worked to one side. Was the removal of them a benefit, or was it simply a bad idea in the first place to have them at all in lieu of additional anti-aircraft guns, and just let the cruisers and destroyers protect it from other ships? Well, the inclusion of the 8-inch guns on the Lexingtons, obviously Lexington went down with hers, Saratoga had hers removed because she survived long enough to have them refitted. This came down to how they thought carriers were going to be used at the time that they were constructed. So whether or not they were a bad idea really depends on the time period you're looking at. When the Lexingtons came into service, the US didn't have that many heavy cruisers, or indeed cruisers of any sort, with any significant range. And you've got to remember that at that point, the US fleet was broadly divided into the scouting force and the battle force. The carriers were in the scouting force. They were not seen as battle line weapons at that point. And one of the mission profiles that they expected the carriers to do would be to work with the cruisers and go in on raids. And you kind of actually see this behaviour in the early part of World War II, before Midway and Guadalcanal, etc. The early stages, you see US carriers going in, launching some airstrikes with cruisers and destroyers as escort. Not a kind of major offensive, but just to annoy the Japanese, blow things up, and then running away again. And it was thought in the 1920s, certainly, that if the carriers are going to do this over the ranges of the Pacific, there's a strong possibility that destroyers might not be able to accompany them all the way. At which point, as I said, you've got very few cruisers. They've got some Omahas, the Pensacola's, Northamptons maybe just about coming online. But then they look across and they realise, well, if we are raiding the enemy, then the enemy might well have destroyers, battle cruisers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, etc. And because we're raiding the enemy closer to their home territory, there's also going to be probably more of them than we can afford escorts. And there's also a possibility that, the carrier might be caught short. It might be, if it's running fly tops in one direction at high speed, the cruisers that are escorting it may not be in the perfect position to make an intercept. If a fast enemy cruiser force comes over the horizon, they might get in gun range of the carrier before the escorting cruisers can get in a position to drive them away. And in all of that, it kind of makes sense for the carriers to be carrying big, heavy 8-inch guns, because You don't want a carrier to end up in a straight-up gunfight with an enemy cruiser, but if the carrier can turn around and start, volleying 8-inch gunfire, that might make enemy ships that are trying to intercept it back off a little bit. And, okay, there might be a long-range gunfight, but a long-range gunfight is less likely for there to be hits on the carrier than in a short-range gunfight, and it also precludes torpedo use. And that will allow the carrier, hopefully, to start making tracks away, allow the escorting forces to get in position, and worst comes to worst, also allow the carrier to spot and launch aircraft to dissuade the enemy from following them. So these guns make a certain amount of sense, not, as I said, in a sense of, we're going to use them to take on and sink enemy ships, but in a sense of keeping the carrier statistically as significantly safer in a surface action than it might otherwise be. Now, of course, once you get into the mid-1930s, aircraft ranges have gotten a lot longer. The US has more cruisers to escort the carriers, etc., etc. So the odds of the carrier ending up in a surface gunfight are now dramatically lower, at which point then having these big, heavy 8-inch gun turrets makes a lot less sense, and it would make more sense to have more anti-aircraft guns. Simultaneously, obviously, the threat from the air has increased significantly, so that you need more anti-aircraft guns by the late 1930s than you would have done in, say, the late 1920s. So I guess that all adds up to, whether or not those cruiser guns on the carriers make sense and or are a good idea. It depends entirely on what time you're looking at. So late 20s, early 30s. Probably there's a logic to them. Mid-30s, late 30s, and then into the early 40s, they probably should have been removed a bit earlier. Maybe sort of a late 1930s conversion program to remove them and replace them as they were historically with 5-inch 38 mountings would have been a reasonable idea to do. 20 July 1944 asks, what would Japan have done with its carriers if the US Navy had stayed in San Diego in 1940? I think a lot of that depends on why the US Navy is keeping everything in San Diego. Because remember, the deployment to Pearl Harbor was supposed to be part of a statement of intent to effectively scare the Japanese into complying. And it gave it was designed to give at least the idea to the Japanese that, the US is serious about getting them to back off in China. If, let's say, for whatever reason, Roosevelt presses for the deployment to Pearl Harbor and is shot down by massive opposition within the US Navy and within various political circles as well, then that perhaps indicates to Japan America isn't politically serious about trying to stop them, at which point they're going to be looking at deploying the Kiributai more in the Western Pacific and the Southwestern Pacific to further their aims there, because they might come to the estimation that actually the US isn't going to back up their words with action if the Japanese go for the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines and so on and so forth. There isn't really any question of trying to launch a Pearl Harbor style attack on San Diego. The Japanese fleet simply can't go that far without, attacking and taking practically everything west of the US West Coast first. So that's not going to be an issue. But if somehow the US is making signals that convince the Japanese that they are serious about counteracting Japan's moves, they're just not deploying to Pearl Harbor, that's another matter entirely, at which point the Japanese, if they think the US carriers are going to come out, they will probably try and put some kind of picket screen, maybe long-range subs, in the West Coast area to keep an eye on things. But of course, sailing from the West Coast will require stopping over at Pearl Harbor and then sailing on. So it is going to take some time for the US fleet to deploy, which does give the Japanese some flexibility. So at that point, again, they will probably still deploy the Kiributai with their southern offensive into the Southwest Pacific, but they'll probably keep a slightly tighter leash on them, maybe only deploy, say, 4 carriers, keeping the others back, and conduct offensive operations unless and until they hear that the US fleet is deploying, at which point, if they hear, the US carriers have sailed from San Diego, they should, in theory, have enough time to wrap up whatever combat operations they're taking part in, pull the carriers back, do a quick rest and refit, and sail out in full force in time to meet them in whatever battle the US and Japan have decided to have on that particular occasion. So effectively, they're going to be using them in their main offensive. Just to what extent and how involved they're going to get is going to depend on how they're reading the US intentions once the US decides to keep the fleet in San Diego. Michael Gilson asks, I see that a number of navies in the treaty era developed various hydrodynamic tricks, such as the US Navy going with a concave outline forward hull, the Japanese, amongst others, developing a bulbous bow, the Royal Navy developing a transom stern. Would these tricks have interfered with each other, or could they have been combined for added benefit? For example, Yamato having a concave bow and transom stern, Vanguard having a bulbous bow as well as her transom stern, or South Dakota having concave fore and transom stern. Well, it depends on how they're combined. The thing is, each of these things is a trade-off. There is none of those things are universal, 100% buffs to a ship's capability. So it's possible, depending on how you design them, for them to interfere or to benefit each other, but then also if they benefit each other, it's quite likely that the downsides will also amplify each other. So, for example, if you run with a bulbous bow, the bulbous bow has to be configured in a specific way that is ideal for a specific speed. And a transom stern improves your efficiency and performance at speed by effectively creating a fake and therefore weightless extension to your ship, which is better for speed, but makes you less maneuverable and less efficient at low speeds. So if you had, let's say, Vanguard and gave her a bulbous bow that was configured for ideal operation at 30 knots, she would become an incredibly efficient high-speed runner if she's at 30 knots, because the bulbous bow is going to be helping with her hydrodynamics forward, and the transom stern is going to be helping with her hydrodynamics aft. But when she's operating at cruising speed, let's say she's operating at 12 knots, or maybe even coming down to 6 or 8 knots for manoeuvring in harbour, the bulbous bow is now going to make her quite inefficient, and the transom stern further inefficient and less agile. So she's going to be an absolute pig to handle at low speeds, but brilliant at high speeds. And any combination of factors from the various hydrodynamic tricks you want to put together, again, yes, you can configure lots of them for ideal performance at certain speed regiments, but you are going to suffer in other regiments. And it's probably, although the scenario just outlined probably sounds quite bad for low speed maneuvering, it's probably best to put things together in such a way that the negatives all amplify each other in one particular realm of performance, because then you can do your best to try and avoid that particular little realm, as opposed to having all the disbenefits, all the negatives, all scattered throughout various other parts of the ship's performance, which just means you have a generally poor ship outside of one particularly good area of its performance, like, say, high speed. Todd Webb asks, after the British decided that 3 quads just didn't fit the math for the King George V, was any thought given to going with just 2 quads all forward in a Dunkirk-Richelieu type layout? Whilst you do lose 2 guns in broadside on engagement, you actually gain 2 guns in the forward arc only engagement. Essentially no, because by the time those design choices had been made, there were 2 things to consider. One was, as you'll have noticed from the King George V design video, that the sheer number of guns was considered quite important. So 12 14-inch was what they wanted. If they couldn't have that, they wanted 10, because there were ships out there with 9 16-inch guns. Admittedly, the British owned those, but other ships out there with 8 guns had 16-inch guns, Colorados, Nagatos, that kind of thing. And of course you had new shipbuilding like Richelieu herself, which had 8 15-inch guns, and so on and so forth. So dropping down to 8 14-inch guns would be quite a step down in firepower. Having an additional gun or 2 additional guns compared to everybody else kind of partly made up for having slightly smaller weapons. And again, as you will have heard from the King George V design video, it was also about sheer number of shells theoretically increases the number of hits that you're scoring, assuming everyone else's fire control systems are about equal, which in turn increases the chances of knocking out the enemy before they can hit you. So there's the practical issues there, but there's also the other issue of, by the time they've decided that they're going to have to drop 2 guns, the amount of design work that's needed to adjust the barbette and the weighting and the turret from a quad turret to a twin, but otherwise keep the overall layout. Okay, it's annoying, but it can be done. Whereas the design work you'd need to keep the 2 quads forward, remove the entire quad aft, all its magazines, barbette, etc., etc., that would be a significantly greater piece of design work, especially considering you would be completely throwing out the balance of the ship. You'd have to reposition everything. You'd have to basically drag everything backwards just to make sure the ship remained balanced, in crude terms. I mean, there's probably other things you could do, but that would involve either putting in just stupid dead weight, which makes no sense, or, I don't know, ramming in a ton of machinery. So, I mean, in theory, you could get a King George V where, let's say, you replace the magazines and all the space taken up by the aft turret with machinery and ramp up to sort of 32 knots or something like that. But one, that's further back on the hull where the hull's starting to narrow. You've got the propeller shaft in the way. It would be a massive issue to try and redistribute all the internal machinery at that point. So if you were starting maybe a couple of years before the keel's supposed to be laid down, okay, yeah, you could probably make those kind of changes if you wanted to do so, ignoring the previously mentioned stuff about number of guns and caliber. Or maybe you could just up armour even more, I don't know. But by the time they're having to actually make these design decisions, it's a bit too close to call anyway, for the amount of change they'd have to make. Fishing for freshly fished fresh fish for Fish Fry Friday, who apparently hates me because every month that name gets longer and longer, asks, what was the longest range ship-to-ship gun hit in the Age of Sail era? Honestly, no real idea, and I don't think anyone else will know either, for a couple of reasons. One, rangefinders weren't a thing in the Age of Sail, so estimating the range to an enemy target would be done entirely by eye, which means, the distance could be practically anything. And secondly, the longest range ship-to-ship hit in the Age of Sail is probably going to be a product of sheer blind chance. Because, people knew they couldn't aim for toffee past maybe several hundred yards on a moving ship. And so they generally didn't try. They might put some speculative broadsides out there occasionally, but, the cannon themselves could, in theory, shoot a cannonball 3 miles. No one was going to try an engagement at 3 miles, not even against a shore fortification. But they inevitably, given the number of guns, the number of times ships were firing, etc., inevitably there would have been some incident, maybe when, someone was firing on the up roll, trying to aim at a ship that was a little bit away, maybe that was closing on them or something, or maybe in a stern chase and picture was going on. And it might have been to discourage, it might have been speculative, it might have been, just an opening salvo to show intent, but at some point, somewhere down the line in the Age of Sail, one of those cannonballs will have sailed up into the air, past the mile mark, started heading down, and, punched a hole in somebody's sail, or poked a hole in somebody's hull, maybe even just bounced off the hull, and everyone would have gone, well, that was unexpected. And then things would have just carried on. Maybe some really, really unlucky person got hit by it. Who knows? But it would have been one of those pure happenstance luck instances where a cannonball has just carried much, much further than anyone thought it was going to, and just through sheer chance managed to hit roughly what it was aimed at. And who knows, it might not even have been what it was aimed at. It could even have been, you could even have a situation where, let's say at the Battle of Trafalgar, If Bucentaur opens fire on Victory and fires on the Uproll, you could have a situation where a cannonball goes clean over Victory, or maybe goes over Victory's hull but under the sails, sails past Victory, keeps on going, and comes down near the back of the line and hits something like Orion. Those kind of things could also happen in a battle or some similar situation. So it'll have been some hit of that nature, but because we do know there were hits of that kind that were recorded occasionally in various engagements, but exactly which one was the longest range, I say no one was measuring and no one had the ability to. Matt Kidd asks, the US built many warships during World War II and would have had to give command of hundreds of destroyers, destroyer escorts and submarines to officers who had never held a command before. Was there a special course or school that these commanders were put through, and was it different than the peacetime school? Not really, because you've got to remember that anyone down to, technically speaking, even a lieutenant, could be given command of a small vessel. I mean, USS Ward, when she was patrolling outside of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, was under the command of a lieutenant. So anyone of that rank or upwards is technically eligible to command a ship and will have had some training, at least on the job, in how to command and run a ship before they're given that appointment. So they'll have that in place, and so they might be expected to take command a little bit earlier than they might otherwise have expected. But you've also got to remember that when it comes to the peacetime Navy, quite often you would have a glut of officers. So during peacetime, you might have, if you think almost any US Navy lieutenant who's been on the appropriate career path, or lieutenant commander or captain, might all be eligible for some form of command, but a good chunk of them are going to stay as first officers, second officers, etc. on various ships, simply because there aren't that many ships in the fleet to command. And although obviously as an XO you would get a fair degree of experience in commanding a vessel, even if you weren't the captain. And then when war breaks out and all these ships are being built, and as you say, commissioned, having to have crews put aboard them, a lot of it is just going to be, that 2, 3, 4 year wait between when you're technically able to command a ship and when you might actually get a command. That gap, that wait might just not happen. You just end up being given the command, and you might also end up being in that command for a lot longer. So you might be rotated through different commands relatively quickly, sort of every 6 months or 12 months, something like that. In a peacetime Navy, apart from anything, just to to give other people a chance at commanding a ship, and people can be rotated back to Annapolis or the War College or whatever. But then in wartime, you might just be given a command and told, right, this is your command, good luck. Well, you didn't have to wait 2 years for it. Now have fun, and we'll see you in 1945. Which did actually legitimately happen to one or two people. They were given command of ships in 42 and, didn't really see much else other than the deck of the ship that they were assigned to for 2, 3, 4 years on occasion. Vokir asks, can you expand a little more on the maintenance and repair scam the US Navy pulled in the 1870s and 80s to get more modern ironclads built from existing materials and an unwilling Congress? Has any other Navy tried this or something similar in the past? Other navies have certainly tried to pull off similar schemes in the past and have occasionally succeeded, although not necessarily quite to the same scale as what the US Navy managed to pull off. One or two got a little bit close, but what the US Navy managed to pull off really does take the biscuit. So here, for example, is USS Puritan. Now, you might think, well, that looks like, maybe an 1880s, 1890s design. Yes, you would be correct. That is near enough what it is. Actually ordered in the mid-1870s, but by the time she's in service with the fleet, it is, launched in 1882, commissioned in 1896. She is very much of the immediately approaching pre-dreadnought era. And she's 6,000 tons. She has a couple of twin 12-inch breech-loading rifled guns, So in some ways, I guess she resembles kind of a halfway house between something like the Devastation and a pre-dreadnought. But in theory, this ship is a Civil War era monitor, which is a blatant lie, because the original USS Puritan was just over 3,000 tons, so a little bit over half the displacement that this particular iteration of it is. It was only supposed to have a single turret carrying a pair of 20-inch Dahlgrens, and yeah, in appearance, well, if you imagine a slightly enlarged version of the original USS Monitor herself, with obviously slightly bigger guns and a more prominent funnel, that's basically what the original flavour USS Puritan was going to look like. She sat around for over a decade on the stocks. No one wanted to pay for to complete her. And then the US Navy, obviously, they wanted a new ship. They weren't going to get Congress to pay for a new ship, because Congress was in one of its periods where it didn't want to pay for anything, especially a Navy. And so they said, well, we've had this ship sitting on the stocks for ages. It's taking up space. We just want to repair it and get that in service instead. And if we do, well, then we can decommission, 2 or 3 of our older ships, and that'll save money. So, just give us a few dollars to repair the old Puritan. And Congress kind of like, okay, I guess that makes sense. Unusual they've stopped asking for new money, but, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And then, of course, the US Navy went and basically sold off what was left of the old Puritan, kept a few planks and a few bits of iron for, as a fig leaf covering, and then ordered this thing, which is very blatantly not an American Civil War era ironclad. It's got masts, it's got superstructure, it's got, double the number of guns, and they're breech loading the rifled guns. It's got a little bit more freeboard. It's much larger. It's a brand new ship. It's as much the same USS Puritan as you going out and buying a brand new car, but I don't know, keeping the steering wheel cover and the floor mats from the old car makes your new car the old car. It is one of the most spectacularly blatant pieces of fraud ever perpetuated on a political system, and I can only stand up and applaud the US Navy for having the audacity not just to try it, but to actually successfully pull it off. Yeah, and they go on to do a few other similar things with various other ships that were notionally repaired during the period, but I think Puritan really is the epitome of the whole concept. DJ Hurd asks, warship armour. Today we have a number of lighter substances that are close to the strength of steel. How much research into different hull and armour materials was done, and were there any promising items from that research? Well, it depends on the period you're looking at. Around the period that ironclads started to become a thing, there was an awful lot of research looking at different hull and armour materials. Everything from replacing the wood backing with rubber backing to just making armour completely of rubber, to literally, big sheets of rubber stuck over the wooden hull of a normal ship. And that's not even the craziest things. I mean, even when you're looking at just iron, obviously Kearsarge, in its fight with Alabama, improvised some armour, well, you can loosely describe it as that, made out of chains, but there were proposals looking to see, can the production of iron chain provide a quick and easy armouring solution for ships? But broadly, they don't tend to work out. Now, when it comes to the later period, as you indicate, going past when this channel looks at, the main problem you have is that the advances in material science that would give us something that, at least on paper, might do a better job than face-hardened steel, don't happen for quite some time after the armoured warships is basically effectively being phased out. So, stuff like composite armour, like you have on modern tanks, is a product of the late 70s, early 80s, by which point, apart from the Iowas being brought back, the armoured warship is several generations gone. Earlier than that, in theory, you have stuff like titanium, which is not actually, contrary to popular belief, not actually that much stronger than steel. And depending on the steel, it may actually be somewhat weaker. But the main thing with titanium is it offers a broadly similar strength to steel, but much, much lighter than steel. So, referencing, for example, one of my other hobbies of medieval reenactment, you can get titanium brigandines as well as steel brigandines, but the main advantage you get with the titanium is that it's incredibly light. The actual thickness of the titanium plates it's in the same region as the thickness of plates you'd get of steel anyway. It's just going to not tire you out quite as much. And that's before you get into the problems of how you actually make titanium in the late 50s, early 60s, how expensive it is, and also you've also got to bear in mind that face-hardened armour as used in battleships is much, much, much stronger than just being a slab of steel, because you have the differential hardening, you have incredibly hard face, the softer back, etc. and so on. At least as far as what I can recall from my engineering days, I'm pretty sure you either can't face-hardened titanium, or if you can, it would be an incredibly difficult and expensive process to do because of the way they have to manufacture it. And, if you're going to put a 12-inch thick belt of titanium armor on a ship, yeah, you really want to have won every single lottery on the planet. Several times over if you're going to start thinking about, stripping an Iowa's belt armor and deck armor away and replacing it with similar thicknesses of titanium, because at that point, it'll be similar levels of protection, assuming you can get something equivalent to the face hardening going and saving an awful lot of weight, but my goodness, will that cost a lot. You'd probably just be better off just gold plating the ship and using its wonderful reflectivity to dazzle your enemies. But effectively what it comes down to is that you need just sheer mass and volume when you're talking about battleship armour. There's nothing that's so much stronger than battleship face-hardened steel armour that you can afford to get away with a very thin layer of it, and everything that offers a degree of improved protection over battleship grade steel armor is also much more expensive, and therefore if you were going to put it in either as equivalent or greater protective value thicknesses, the cost is just going to be astronomical. Matt Blob asks, during the Age of Sail, were there certain species of oak valued for their strength in shipbuilding, and were certain zones of certain forests ever known for producing lumber of distinctive quality for use in building warships? To a degree, yes. I mean, we've all heard about live oak and white oak in the US 6 frigates, but at the same time, you've got to bear in mind that people had to build ships with what they had available. If a country was building their ship out of, let's say, regular European oak, they might want to build it out of live oak or white oak in certain portions of the hull, but if they don't have trade with the United States, either because they're unfriendly with the US or Britain's put a blockade around them or whatever other reason, then they're not going to be able to get hold of it, so they're just going to have to make do. Others might have that trade available, but it might be too expensive to buy that amount of timber and bring it in. Or there might be good enough local versions available. I mean, some ships were built for the Royal Navy out of teak because there was a lot of teak in India, and that's where the ships were being built, so why not? The Spanish obviously built the Santa Sima Trinidad out of mahogany, which would be eye-wateringly expensive these days, but back in those days they were thinking, well, we're building it in our South and Central America empire, so there's a lot of mahogany there's not a tremendous amount of oak. Mahogany is a very dense hard wood. I guess we're building it out of mahogany then. If anybody ever finds that wreck, they'll make a flipping fortune if they can turn it into furniture. But as far as certain zones of certain forest known for producing lumber of distinctive quality, it was... Okay, there were some forests and areas of forest that were known for giving particularly good timber, but it was more about how the timber was managed than a natural inherent advantage of the soil conditions for the most part. Although you could get some advantage in those cases, it was more so the case that when you were getting your oak trees grown or whatever timber, because obviously mast timber is not oak and so forth, you wanted it to be growing consistently for a long period of time in the shape, ideally, that you wanted it to, and then once it was cut down, you had to season it for a very long time if you wanted the ship to last. Building a ship out of green timbers was a recipe for having a ship for a few years, and then it would rot out if you were lucky. So it was more about just identifying areas where the climate was particularly favourable to it. And we're talking about long-term investments here. I mean, forget the short-term thinking of these days. People were planting forests perfectly understanding that neither they nor indeed their children would probably see the benefit of it, but maybe their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren, or maybe even their great-great-grandchildren might be able to sustain their navies on the basis of what they were doing at that point by, replanting forests that they'd cut down but they knew were particularly good for growing timbers. And, there are occasionally these days the odd amusing news story that will pop up because, some forest in Sweden or the USA or occasionally even in the UK has finally popped in its notice to say, yep, the trees we planted 150, 200 years ago to, be ready for the next generation of wooden warships, well, you'll be glad to know they're ready to be cut down. Yeah, I know you're building everything out of steel these days, but, just so you know, just in case. Excelsior 1 asks, why were nations always wanting to get bigger and bigger guns instead of focusing on shell technology? Metallurgy surely was advancing fairly rapidly, and with superchargers and fusing technology, I think you could get the same penetration or close to it with an upgraded 14-inch as a standard 16-inch, with the weight savings going into more secondaries and armour plating. I mean, yes, to a certain degree, but whilst some technology was advancing pretty rapidly overall, you're talking about rapid advancing technology in terms of, maybe a decade or two down the line we'll have something particularly impressive to go with. Even something like, say, the Midway shells, which the US produced in World War One and shortly thereafter, which were extremely hard shells, that was the product of about part of a decade's worth of work. Whereas new capital ships with new and improved main gun batteries, especially in the sort of the run-up to and during World War One, were being launched every year or two. So the acceleration of battleships actually vastly outstripped the acceleration of gun technology for the most part, apart from the, relatively speaking, simple way of making a bigger gun. I mean, that's still a fairly complex process, but as was shown by the development from 12-inch to 13.5-inch to 14 to 15 to 16-inch guns, you could do that in the space of a decade or less. In fact, well, the time period between Dreadnought's 12-inch 45 caliber guns and the Queen Elizabeth's launching with 15-inch guns is well under a decade. In fact, it's barely 6 or 7 years. And in that time, you could make there may be a few advances in shell technology, but nothing massively different between a 15-inch shell in 1913 and a 12-inch shell in 1906, except for a slightly different fuse and bigger. And maybe the head circumference radius had changed slightly, but, not big steps the way that a 12 to a 15-inch gun was. And the other factor is the quantity has a quality all of its own, and in this particular area the quantity is mass, which also has a certain degree of strength to it involved, because, thanks to the square cube law, a 15-inch shell is going to weigh a lot more than a 12-inch shell. I mean, that's fairly obvious, but, a from going from a 12 to a 15-inch shell is a 25% increase in diameter, but it's a lot more than a 25% increase in mass. And that means that you're hitting your opponent with a lot more energy. Even if the shell technology is exactly the same for the 12 and the 15-inch shell, there's just so much more energy imparted by the 15-inch, which is going to help break through the armour. And also, more volume of solid metal means it's overall got higher strength. And this, although it's a extreme and slightly crude analogy, hopefully serves to get the point across, but you come across what I would say is the ping pong ball issue. So if you imagine a ping pong ball and a golf ball, now you could throw them both at something fairly light, let's say a sheet of paper. You might struggle to break through a sheet of paper with a ping pong ball. You probably won't struggle too hard to throw a golf ball through a sheet of paper, so light armour protection. But if you, say, put the ping pong ball in an air cannon, you can blast straight through that piece of paper quite easily. So you might think, okay, well, we'll just keep using ping pong balls. But once you get up to a certain point, let's say, an inch thick slab of wood, yeah, you might be able to send a ping pong ball through that if you, ramp it up through like a 50-foot air cannon like the Mythbusters did on occasion. At which point you've just gone completely absurd in the amount of technology you're throwing at the problem to get this small, lightweight projectile through. Whereas you'd be able to send the golf ball through that same 1-inch thick block of wood with a lot less effort, just because of the significantly increased mass that thing has. And then you're going to run into issues where, within the realms of what is practically conceivable, you are never going to send a ping pong ball through something like, say, I don't know, a 2-3 mil sheet of steel, whereas with a bit of creative technology you might be able to get a golf ball to go through that. And that's again down to just the sheer strength and mass of the golf ball versus the relatively weak material and lightweight of the ping pong ball. Now, I say crude analogy, but it kind of illustrates the point of that within the realms of what you can conceivably do to improve shell technology in, say, the 3 to 5 year development cycle of the average naval gun, assuming you're not rushing it, as compared to the increase in size of guns that you can do in 3 to 5 years, you're going to be able to put a lot more firepower out with a bigger, heavier gun, and there will be a limit to what your smaller shell can do against progressively heavier and thicker pieces of armour before it will just start shattering. So that all of those factors are going to go into play when it comes to why everybody is going for bigger and bigger guns. Now, granted, once you start getting to a certain point where it becomes quite difficult to reload the guns in good time, and because of the square cube law, the weight of the guns itself goes up quite a lot, etc., etc., i.e. around about the 16 to 18-inch gun area, then you do start seeing some differentiation of thought, where some people are thinking, and at some certain times thinking, well, we'll go for 18 or 20-inch guns in smaller and smaller numbers, and other people are going for 16-inch guns in much larger numbers. It's kind of a little bit all over the place at that point. But, it's kind of like when you look at, say, the Alaska class, and sometimes people make a little bit too much of an issue of, oh yeah, the Alaska class's 12-inch guns had the same kind of armour penetration as the 14-inch guns on US battleships. Like, yes, to a certain degree true, not true across the entire firing range, but okay, let's say within reasonable battle ranges, that's a broadly accurate statement. But you're looking at 25 plus years of technological advancement, and you've now managed to get a gun caliber that's 2 inches smaller, that has approximately, within certain values, the same kind of penetration as a gun that's 25 years old, but slightly bigger. And if someone had put that same technology that had gone into the Alaska's 12-inch gun into a modern 14-inch gun, I can guarantee that 14-inch gun would massively outperform the Alaska's gun. And that 12-inch gun still doesn't hold a candle to, the 15s and 16s other nations are rolling around, whether they be older or newer weapons. So, sometimes bigger is better. You can make certain improvements beyond that to make your 16-inch gun better than the other guy's 16-inch gun by improving your shell tech. But ultimately, just improving your shell technology at the expense of upgrading the caliber of your guns is probably going to leave you behind.
And that brings us to an end to this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Just one quick heads up. On the 4th of February, that is Friday, a couple of weeks from now, I will be releasing a Fun Friday which will detail the details of the America trip. So if you're interested in coming to say hi or just knowing where I'm going to be in April, that will be the opportunity to get all the details before I step on a plane.